Hello boys and girls, Lord Hawkeye here again. Well, I've pretty much seen all I want to see in the beta, and I don't want to risk finding some rare thing that I won't get to keep, so with a month or so to go before Mists of Pandaria goes live, I thought it would be a nice idea to look back, reflect, and contemplate this game, which I have played for a very long time now. I think a lot has been clouded over the years, so it would be very healthy to give it all a more objective view. So, let's think back to how we got where we are now. Let's look at the content of old and judge what was good and what wasn't. Vanilla. Before World of Warcraft, I played Final Fantasy XI. A friend of mine got into WoW and told me I should give it a try. I was hesitant at first. People had claimed that the game was too easy, holds your hand and just offers everything to you. I'm sure the irony of that won't be lost on a lot of you. I played a Mithra Paladin in Final Fantasy XI, so naturally, my first character was a human paladin that I played until level 60, but I became disinterested when I found out the hard way that paladins couldn't actually tank despite having a spec for it. I had a gnome warrior that I made for the fun of it by the name of Shamibel, a name that I created by reading a list of gnome names from a D&D book. My love was always tanking, so I ended up adopting her as my main, and thus Shamibel's long adventure began. Vanilla had no past expansion to compare to, so instead I'm going to compare it to the state of MMOs in general at the time. During these days, MMOs like EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI were the big boys in town. Back then, MMOs were a niche within a niche, so to speak. Video games were still for nerds, and MMOs were strictly for the especially dedicated nerds. They demanded massive time investment, contained tremendous amount of grinding, and required cooperating with other players to achieve even the simplest goals, such as leveling your character. World of Warcraft was unique among them. The game was designed around being able to level solo no matter what class you were, and grouping was something you only needed to do for dungeons and certain quests. This is something I think a lot of my fellow WoW players have forgotten. WoW appealing more to casual players is not a new idea bred by the Wrath of the Lich King. It was this game's mission statement from the very beginning. Many of you would do well to remember that. Even at its most hardcore, WoW was still very casual compared to what came before. WoW's popularity soared, proving that the world truly had been waiting for a more open and friendly MMO environment, and that elitism was ultimately not a good business model. That being said, Vanilla was still new, so of course it had many problems such as class imbalances, pigeonholed rating roles, uneven level progression in zones, and many others. However, let's walk through the raids to get a better idea of how WoW evolved during these days. The first raiding instance was Molten Core, which illustrated the first problem WoW suffered. Despite having cut a lot of it out compared to other past MMOs, WoW still had too much filler and not enough meat. Molten Core was long and repetitive. Trash mobs took up far too much of the contents, and many bosses had minimal strategy or excitement to them. Some even had classes standing around doing nothing for the entire encounter, Shazrath being the prime example. Some like to look back on Molten Core with fondness, but I think it's very important to differentiate between fun that came from the game itself and fun that came from the people you played with. Molten Core was fun for the people you played with. Imagine running it with people you never talked to. You'd have fallen asleep half through every single time. Next came Blackwing Lair. Now this is where things started looking up, at least at first glance. The first two bosses had no trash leading to them, and they introduced new mechanics that required a change in how you ran your raid. Although personally I wasn't a fan of the first boss. Kiting is boring and does not feel like a battle to me, but that's just my opinion. However, after that, it started falling back into bad habits. You then had to slog through one of the most needlessly tedious and frustrating mechanics to get to a boss who was barely more interesting than your average trash mob. And what came after that? More trash mobs, and 3 completely stock bosses who were not interesting in the slightest. I mean, seriously, ask any old school raider to name all the bosses of Blackwing Lair. Those 3 drakes will always be the ones he has the most trouble remembering. Thankfully, things did pick up for the last 2 bosses, so overall, Blackwing Lair did at least end on a high note. Then came Anchorage. This raid experimented with a new idea. setting up a huge event all over the world prior to its opening, including a really long quest that someone on the server had to complete to be given the honors of opening it. Well, this certainly did drum up more interest in the raid, to be sure, but in the end it also brought to light a problem that was developing. Fewer and fewer people were seeing this new content, as the barriers to entry were getting higher and higher with each new raid. Many people were still stuck on Blackwing Lair or even Molten Core, so many who participated in the event felt cheated, as though they worked purely so the hardcore raiders could get all the fun. The raid itself? AQ was a bit of a mixed bag. It continued to improve on making boss mechanics more interesting, and the final fight with Cthulhu was truly a marvel to behold. On the other hand, it inexplicably had even more filler content for the actual dungeon. AQ was massive, long, and contained tremendous amount of trash. The trash before Cthulhu was infamous, sometimes taking half an hour for a raid to recover from a wipe, of which there were many. This put even more people off from raiding, a problem that will only start to get addressed after the next raid, Naxxramas. Naxxramas was the last raid of Vanilla, and it was a great example of a good idea ruined by a single oversight. First of all, making a dungeon based from the Lich King was a great idea. Unlike Cthulhu, the Lich King was a very well-known villain that everyone had dealt with in the game in some fashion. This created much more investment in Naxxramas than AQ, where the lore was only mainly known to raid guilds who did the opening quests. In addition, Naxxramas featured a great atmosphere, solid boss mechanics, and did rein in the trash content considerably. Sadly, all of this was wasted due to one problem. Only 1% of the entire player base of WoW had ever set foot in Naxxramas. The barrier to entry was growing, resulting in Blizzard putting more and more work for the sole enjoyment of a smaller and smaller audience. To make matters worse, finicky and unforgiving boss encounters shrunk this target audience even further. Many servers had nary a single guild who had even come close to completing it. While the few who did might have enjoyed this elite status, it was clear this cycle could not be allowed to continue lest World of Warcraft alienate its entire fan base that it had been so fortunate to acquire. Something had to be done. That was when Blizz decided it was time to shake things up. This came in the form of the Burning Crusade, which we'll get into next time. Until then, be aware and be wise.